I wanted to welcome you on behalf of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, who is co-sponsoring this event with the Sociology Department's Critical Race Initiative. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the director of the Baha'i Chair. We are located in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, and it's really a privilege today for us to have Dr. Christina Getrich, who I'll introduce to you in a minute, but I also want to acknowledge Dr. Paul Shackle, the chairperson of the Anthropology Department in the back, way back. Immigration is a very important topic, especially in this century, with a number of events that have happened throughout the world. And in particular, I think it is an interesting topic in a fluid, globalizing world, which has many consequences when it comes to the problem of immigration and how to resolve it in a manner that's just and fair. And the problem is that in different parts of the world, countries have to treat it differently. I mean, sometimes immigrants and refugees are escaping conditions that are unsatisfactory for them, maybe lack of jobs, maybe persecution of all kinds, and maybe war, maybe danger to their lives, to their livelihood, and sometimes genocide. So it's a very complex issue. And I think, just quickly, I wanted to bring a couple of ideas that this author, Yuval Harari, you may have heard of him, historian, Lessons for the 21st Century. He raises some interesting questions about the problems, especially that a democratic society faces in relation to immigration. And he just to raise some of his questions, he says it would be wrong of any government to force large-scale immigration on unwilling local population. Absorbing immigration is a difficult long-term process, and to successfully integrate immigrants, you must have the support and cooperation of the local population. The one exception to this rule, he further explains, is that countries are obliged to open their borders to refugees escaping death in a neighboring country, even if the local population doesn't like it. Secondly, though citizens have a right to oppose immigration, they should realize that they still have obligations towards foreigners. We are living in a global world, and whether we like it or not, our lives are intertwined with the lives of people on the other side of the planet. They grow our food. They manufacture our clothes. They might die in a war fought for our oil prices. They might be a victim of our lax environmental laws. We ought not to ignore our ethical responsibilities to people just because they live far away or in a neighboring country. So those are, I think, some of the questions, not all of them, of course, that this issue really raises and has raised throughout the world in recent years. So this is why I'm really pleased that today we have Dr. Christina Getrich from the Anthropology Department, who is going to address one aspect of this issue, and I'm in particular her research on Mexican American families and Mexican immigrant families. Just to tell you a little bit about her, Dr. Christina Getrich is Director of Graduate Studies and Assistant Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland. She is a social, cultural, and critical medical anthropologist whose research examines the incorporation of mixed immigration status families into U.S. society and immigration-related health disparities. Dr. Getrich has conducted research in the U.S. Mexican borderlands for more than 20 years. Her book, entitled Border Brokers, Border Brokers, Children of Mexican Immigrants Navigating U.S. Society, Laws, and Politics, is published with the University of Arizona Press in 2019. And what she does in the book is conduct a longitudinal examination of the lives of the children of Mexican immigrants who grew up in mixed status families living in San Diego, Tijuana borderlands. She also has published 25 articles in a range of interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journals, and she received her PhD from the University of New Mexico. She joined the faculty at the University of Maryland in 2014. Please welcome her to the podium. She will speak to us on the, you can't clap yet. She will speak to us on, as you see, the immigration officers are always around, U.S. immigration enforcement and ethnoracial profiling in immigrant communities. Dr. Getrich.
Thank you so much, Hoda, for the warm welcome, and I think I'm a little closer to the microphone, so perhaps that won't be a problem anyway. But I'd like to say thank you, first of all, for coming out on this dreary afternoon to come hear about a pretty depressing topic. But I'm hoping to come full circle and give you some signs of hope and talk about what we can all do in the collective at the end of the talk. So I'd like to start out by introducing you to Isabel Clemente. Born and raised in San Diego, Isabel Clemente is the daughter of Mexican immigrant parents who are from the same neighborhood in Tijuana, less than 15 miles away from their San Diego home, but with this heavily fortified border standing in the way. Her parents met when they were teenagers in their Tijuana neighborhood and got married. They followed the husband's family to Southern California, and so her parents made the decision to migrate with heavy heart on the part of her mother, who left behind her large extended family back in Tijuana. Despite the proximity of their neighborhoods, the neighborhood they're from and the neighborhood in which they live, for more than 20 years, the Clementes have been unable to go back home, separated again by this border that's gotten in the way for them. But despite the fact that the parents were unable to go and visit with family and connect with family on the other side of the border, they ensured that their children did. So Isabel and her two younger siblings. And they did so by sending her and her siblings with other family members who had legal immigration status and could cross. Isabel really cherished this time with her extended family. She's quite close with both sets of grandparents and really embraced the family that she had there, this large family that she didn't have in San Diego. But at the same time, she reflected that it always felt like there was something missing being there without her parents. Each time that Isabel waited to reunite with her family, waited in the border crossing line to reunite with her family, her parents on the other side of the U.S. Mexico border, she experienced profound anxiety about potential interactions with customs and border protection agents as she made her way through this border crossing, right? She recalled, when I was younger, I would always get terrible butterflies in my stomach before I crossed the border. I always went to the store and bought gum because I was so nervous. Isabel also experienced profound nervousness in her daily life in San Diego, despite being a U.S. citizen. As she went about doing mundane activities like making her way through the neighborhood, shopping for basic necessities with her family members, and taking public transportation to school and work. And so this, as she did these things, it was all under the surveillance of the Border Patrol, whose ever-presence and pattern of ethno-racial profiling plagued her neighborhood at this point for decades, right? And led her to say, as I used in the quote and in the title of my talk here, the immigration officers are always around roaming the streets. And she said that to me when she was 15 years old. So it was very clear to her, even in her childhood, the deep imprint on her neighborhood of the Border Patrol. Going to try to tack back and forth between these. So the immigration enforcement regime that has framed Isabel's entire life has commanded increasing public attention and indeed scrutiny as the budget balloons for it year after year and the purview of it expands. This enforcement regime consists of everyday policing of borders and communities that Isabel has described in particular ways, with surveillance literally extending out into the Pacific Ocean on the edge of San Diego and Tijuana here. It also consists of increasingly high-profile workplace raids and home raids. This is a picture from August 2019 raid in a Mississippi community, small Mississippi communities that ended up resulting in the arrest of 680 people and sent ripple effects through these very small communities. It also consists of highly controversial immigrant detention practices that have garnered increasing attention as we've seen families and children being subjected to cruel forms of torture within these spaces. It also is characterized by removals and deportations, increasing numbers, ever-increasing numbers, and this happening regardless in both Democrats and Republican administrations, right, as we've seen these numbers climbing. And these deportations have important ripple effects on families like Isabel's and in communities like the one in which she grew up. Also notable in the current moment is the evolving modes of surveillance that we're experiencing. Just in the past few weeks and months, we've heard about these new proposals, things like collecting DNA samples from migrants in custody as a means of tracking them. We've heard about the use of cell phone location data as a tool for tracking down migrants. And just in the last few days, the deployment of the special operations Border Patrol teams to sanctuary cities and jurisdictions to aid in tracking down migrants. So certainly we see a long history of these processes, but also new and contemporary configurations that are unfolding every day, right? So we can read immigration enforcement in several different ways, but here I'd like to draw from the sociologist Aranda Vaquera, who argue that immigration enforcement is a colorblind racial project of the state. It functions in some respects by relying on these ostensibly race-neutral legal discourses, right? It's about law and order. It's about what is legal and what is illegal. But we see, and as I'll demonstrate briefly, that they're built on a structural foundation of racism. So in fact, they are not neutral in this focus, again, on sort of law and order and putting it in the realm of legal discourse. And so I'm drawing from this sort of view of immigration enforcement. I'm also drawing from colleagues in public health who look at the ways in which immigration enforcement builds and operates through the policing of racialized legal status as a particular social position that has fundamental health effects. Right? So in the language of public health, racialized legal status serves as a social determinant of health, but we see it bearing disproportionate impact on racial and ethnic communities. When we look in the language of medical anthropology, which of course is my field, we can see the ways in which the immigration enforcement regime renders immigrant families structurally vulnerable, producing very particular forms of distress and anxiety in that context. So my presentation today is really in conversation with all of these different disciplinary ways of trying to make sense of and understand immigration enforcement regime. So my research, broadly speaking, examines the impact of changing immigration policies and enforcement practices over the last 20 years. I'm, in particular, as a sociocultural anthropologist, interested in how immigrant families experience, navigate, and contest these policies and practices in their everyday lives. I'm drawing from, in this talk and my research more broadly, multiple geographic locales. So I'm going to start in the U.S. Mexico borderlands, where I've been working since 2000, looking at the U.S. Mexico border region, in particular for this talk in California, although I've also done research in Arizona and New Mexico. And I'll point out that these are very different contexts of reception, right? California and Arizona in particular provide a pretty stark contrast here in terms of what life looks like for immigrants in these different states. Since 2016, I've also been conducting research in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. I came to the University of Maryland in 2014 and sort of quickly got going in terms of looking at this local sets of immigration enforcement issues here. In terms of the populations that I focus on and the units of analysis that I'm going to kind of shine a light on here today, I have spent most of my career working with Mexican immigrant families and working in this borderland context. And so that's been the primary population of focus, in part because of sort of the geographic configuration of that space. But as I've moved into my research here in the Washington, D.C. area, I've worked much more with immigrants of more diverse national origins. In this area, the Latinx population, looking at Central Americans and those from South America, as well as doing research and work with immigrants who happen to be from Asian and African countries of origin. And so a lot of this work has been with deferred action for childhood arrivals, so looking at sort of the unifying aspects of this status, but understanding how it's experienced differently by these different national origin groups. I focus quite a bit on mixed status families and the vulnerabilities of this family unit, the ways in which the experiences of one family member, such as Isabel's parents, map onto other family members as well. So mixed status families are families in which there's a combination of people of different immigration statuses. So we see citizens, residents, or lawful permanent residents, as they're technically known, people with in-between statuses like DACA, as well as undocumented immigrants. And within these families, I'm especially focused on young adults. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking through how the immigration enforcement regime affects young people as they're coming of age within that context, and how that sort of shapes their transition into adulthood, and the roles that they play in society having been shaped in their developmental processes by this. So that's sort of the scope of my research in broad stroke. In terms of my talk today, I'm going to provide a brief background on relevant U.S. immigration policies. I'm certainly not at the depth that my historian colleagues or my political science colleagues would. We're going to briefly get into that, and mostly with the purpose of establishing this history of exclusion and pattern of ethnoracial profiling, right, that's deeply embedded within this immigration enforcement regime. I'll then continue by highlighting some research findings from these two different research trajectories in California and here in Maryland, looking at the implications of immigration-related vulnerability. So how is it configured in these different spaces? To do so, and I'll do this in parallel, first with my San Diego research and then here locally, by looking at the local configurations of enforcement. So what does enforcement look like in these different spaces? I'll continue by highlighting results demonstrating the lived and embodied experiences of enforcement. And in particular, the results I'm presenting today are focused in this realm of mental health, although there are certainly broader health effects that I can speak to if anybody cares to hear about them. I'm also interested, and Hoda, you'd asked me to talk about sort of strategies for contesting immigration enforcement, this exclusion, right? And so I'm interested in sort of mapping these strategies of youth and of immigrant families as they go about contesting exclusion, but also promoting inclusion. So what does that look like in these two different spaces from the perspectives of people who are engaged in this political project? And then I will conclude with some thoughts sort of tying these two trajectories together. So beginning by starting looking at the deep history of exclusion, of course we have to look back to the founding of our nation, right? And one of the earliest policies that sort of or built-in stratification right to it, which was the Naturalization Act of 1790. So the Naturalization Act restricted citizenship to free white men of good character. So right from the beginning, we see a particular type of inclusion for a limited set of individuals. In the process, excluding women, indentured servants, slaves and free blacks, American Indians, and Asians. So exclusion then is hardwired right into these policies right from the beginning of the founding of our nation. We see that then carrying forward in particular, and I'm going to go pretty quickly here through historical periods, but mapping into the next century, right, when we see the emergence of the Page Act of 1875, as well as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which is, I think, more commonly known. The Page Act was focused specifically on women, whereas the Chinese Exclusion Act was focused more on male laborers. But both prohibited the entry of Chinese laborers to the United States. But were the first laws to target a specific ethnic or national group. So with the Naturalization Act, you see major segments of the population being left out, but not with this explicit rhetoric, right? And so there was language, the language that was used in the Chinese Exclusion Act was very stigmatizing, right? And played on stereotypes of the time. And of course we see in this image here, hip hooray, the white man is on top, right? So racial exclusion and the privileging of whiteness being deeply embedded within these policies. So around the same time, we also see the particular targeting of Mexican immigrants and the ways in which that becomes built right into border enforcement, right? The origins of border enforcement. We see an early image here. And so some of that anti-Mexican sentiment was unleashed, or racism, if we want to say it more strongly, unleashed during the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. And so that's certainly setting the stage for border enforcement from what is yet to come. We see early versions of this, right, in the Texas Rangers and other vigilante groups that were monitoring the border in more informal ways, but then carrying forward this really is the stage, right, or the foundation for the establishment of the Border Patrol in 1924. So the mandate of the Border Patrol was to enforce immigration restrictions by preventing unauthorized crossing and by explicitly policing the border. However, it was a pretty broad mandate, and the reality is it was difficult for individual agents to sort of put this into practice, right? So Kelly Little Hernandez, the MacArthur genius, of course, newly anointed, fabulous scholar, has written about the Border Patrol in her book Migra, which preceded the current one that's gotten a lot of attention, right? But she argues that enforcement is a site of racialization and ultimately serves as a tool of state violence. So if we're looking at this process, again, in this period of time, we can see that the agents who were carrying forward, again, this broad mandate, were white men, many of whom were sort of 1 to 2 generations removed from farming, and had military or policing backgrounds, including with groups like the Texas Rangers. So a lot of them just sort of plugged right into these Border Patrol positions, right? So it's carrying forward sort of this legacy of violence that preceded the formal establishment of the Border Patrol. But the monitoring of the border itself becomes this ritual of abuse and violence, right? But really set up in such a way that it's under the guise of the U.S. nation state, right, that we're enforcing the border in these particular ways, even though it's this ritual of abuse and ultimately racism here. So we have to start, if we're looking at immigration enforcement, if we're looking at border enforcement in particular, we certainly have to take it back to 1924, to the establishment of the Border Patrol, if not to the processes that were already in play before its formal establishment. In terms of how it maps forward then, we can see by looking into the next, the rest of that century, that the border serves as what the scholar Cockcroft has called a revolving door, right? And so the selective enforcement of the border takes place on the basis of several different things, depending on economic cycles, labor needs. In the early years, this was very much driven by agriculture agriculture. So agricultural needs really fueled the opening and the closing of this door. But also electoral politics, which of course is a response in some part to nativist anxieties, right? Some of which is codified in immigration policies, like the 1924 immigration policy also had a lot of nativist impulse in it. So all of these together then shape the degree to which the door is opened and closed during different eras. And so just as sort of quick examples of this, we can see different periods in which the closing of the door took place, right? And so after the Great Depression of the 20s, it was a period in which the door was closed significantly. And here we see the forcible repatriation of nearly 1 million Mexicans, many of whom happened to be U.S. citizens. Of course, this borderland space is being contested and national boundaries are being redrawn, right, in the period leading up to this. So forcible repatriation then takes place within this time zone. And then we see a swing in the other direction as the door is opened in another era, right? And this is through the active recruitment over a 20-year plus period of nearly 4.6 million Mexicans through the Bracero labor recruitment program. So we went into Mexico explicitly to recruit laborers to come to the United States and fill these labor needs. So we see the opening and the closing of the door in these different historical moments, but I certainly want to underscore that there's a steady pattern of policing and profiling that's already firmly established and that continues regardless of if it's more an open or closed period in terms of border enforcement. So this pattern then continues forward, right, through these different eras. In terms of situating the experiences of contemporary populations, we have to look forward through the 70s and the 80s as we see the progressive militarization of the border taking place, as low-intensity conflict doctrine, which Timothy Dunn's written quite a bit about, is coming home to the U.S., which is the incremental introduction of force taking place, and the normalization of it to the point that we no longer question why it is that the border is so militarized when we're not at war with Mexico, right? So how does this take place? The Immigration and Naturalization Service develops this philosophy known as prevention through or by deterrence. And so it specifically implements these in two locations, through Operation Hold the Line in Ciudad Juarez, El Paso in 1993, and then Operation Gatekeeper in 1994 in San Diego and Tijuana. So these were the urban crossing sites where migration had become quite visible, right? Where border crossing was sort of part of the urban landscape. So the idea in some respects was to shift migration out of sight, out of mind a little by pushing it to more remote terrain. In San Diego, where I've done my work, this is taking this westward flow and pushing it eastward towards the mountains and the desert. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened as we see ground zero really for migration becoming Arizona into the 2000s, right? So Operation Gatekeeper did set out to do exactly what it intended, right? Which is pushing migrants towards more remote and dangerous terrain. It doesn't do so as a deterrent, right? Because it's really about much larger forces. And so we have to acknowledge those economic and political forces that shape migration pathways. The way in which it was done was through an infusion of resources. And so we see the Border Patrol budget growing exponentially, right, in the period after the mid-1990s. So we have these new structures, 3-layered fences in San Diego, Tijuana, as well as these smart fences. You can see that border fence construction that has sort of holes in particular areas, these sort of novel structures of fencing that come to be part of it. As well as stadium-style lighting, which lights the night sky everywhere you look. We see it through increased personnel, so Border Patrol agents. Again, the numbers of agents, when you look at the numbers over time, increasing. Through vehicles, so SUVs, ATVs. Who's ever seen a Border Patrol vehicle? What do they look like? Yeah, they have green trim. They're these ubiquitous vehicles when you're in borderland spaces, right? They're white with green trim, instantly recognizable. And so they're everywhere, circling around. But we also see helicopters. So when you're in the border zone, you're also hearing sort of the ever-presence of these helicopters circling around too. Surveillance technologies, of course, have evolved considerably over time, starting with night vision goggles, motion sensors, video tracking systems, and databases have also become increasingly complex, right? And so we see billions and billions and billions of dollars of investment in all of these resources to bolster the work of the Border Patrol. So while border enforcement is focused in many respects on the border and is seeking to interrupt the flow of migrants crossing that border, there's also significant spillover into border communities. And this is because immigration enforcement functions as this diffused form of racial governance, right? And this is because there's an inherent impossibility of determining one's legal status merely by looking at them, right? We don't know the legal status. If I look around the room, I don't know the legal status, the immigration status of everybody who's within this room. But yet, we see Mexican appearance becoming a specific and explicit criterion upon which Border Patrol agents can stop people, right? So this happens through the vehicle of the 1979 Supreme Court decision, United States versus Brignone Ponce. And so this established, it legitimized Border Patrol officers' use of Mexican appearance, and that's how it's framed, as an indicator of the crime of illegal entry. So it provided the justification for stopping people on the basis of Mexican appearance if it was suspected that they participated in this crime of illegal entry, right? And so this codifies ethnoracial profiling in the U.S. Mexico borderlands. So we see then, and in the aftermath of that, and certainly alongside the militarization of the border, Mexican and others regarded as being presumptively illegal, right? Illegal until demonstrated otherwise within this context. And I want to underscore or highlight "and others" in this clause too, because certainly along the U.S. Mexico border, we also see American Indian tribes, right, who are also subjected to these surveillance rituals, including the Tohono O'odham tribe in southern Arizona, whose tribal land is actually divided by the heavily militarized U.S. Mexico border, right? So it creates this environment in which everybody's suspect and can be stopped. Right? So that's an important sort of effect of border enforcement too, right? It's not only localized to the border, but rather permeates out into borderland communities. So part of the story too, in contextualizing the experiences of mixed status immigrant families, is also looking at what's been happening more recently, right, in the early part of this new century, which is intensifying enforcement. And so really a lot of this is through the increasing criminalization of immigrants, right? And the 1996 immigration reform law, I'll spare you the long, unwieldy acronym. I've shorthanded it here, but I won't read the whole thing. But IIRA had provisions related to deportation, as well as sort of paved the way for immigrant detention in the way we know it today. And also fostered cooperation between federal and local governments. So this law was deeply impactful in setting the stage for criminalization of immigrants, right? Immigrant individuals, and of course this has ripple effects in families as well. Moving into this century, we also see this post-9/11 crime, security, immigration nexus emerging, right? And this is epitomized really in 2003 in the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, right? That's what this agency is called now. So Homeland Security becomes the rubric through which we think through a lot of these enforcement dynamics. but also the creation of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in 2003. So ICE didn't exist before that time. The Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection did, but ICE is a relatively new agency, right? And so all of this is with, the broad mandate to protect the homeland. But as part of this, we see sort of justification in protecting the homeland, justification of profiling, right, to support protecting the homeland. But in the process, we see the targeting of new populations as well, right? So Muslim populations in the aftermath of 9/11. We see sort of the broad application of this profiling mentality, again, invoked in justification of defending the homeland. We also see, in the mid-2000s, which is to say the mid-first decade of the 2000s, new initiatives and programs. And these are playing on sort of the militarization, right? So once again, we see Operation Streamline, building on Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Hold the Line, which is explicitly military language, right? But we also see Secure Communities program really building on this trope of security and using that as justification for what's going on. So militarization, security, and increased criminalization of migrants is all part of this new calculus. We also see a spate of new state and local level policies coming into play, such as Arizona's SB 1070 in 2010, also known colloquially as the Show Me Your Papers law, right? Much of which was struck down by the Supreme Court. So it's not only at this point a federal issue, but actually something that we see kind of refracting on the state and local level. As I'll talk about later, though, we can also see the local and state as sites for promoting inclusion and buffering and working against the exclusion that we see at the federal level. But all of this sets the stage in many respects to the work that I've done. And 20 years ago, when I set out to start doing the work that I do, it was really with the idea of trying to make sense of what it's like to grow up in these systems of immigration surveillance, right? And so I call, in my book and elsewhere, I call this generation the gatekeeper generation, right? The young adults who know no other life except for that under Operation Gatekeeper, who are so accustomed to the ever-presence of the Border Patrol, the white vehicles with the green trim, that they know no other way, right? And so that's what I set out to do, was to understand how children in particular in these families made sense of the Border Patrol, made sense of enforcement circling around them. And so my San Diego research is a longitudinal project. I started in 2004. I undertook a period of 12 months, I believe it was, of field work in 2005 and 2006. So this is a place that I continue to go back, right? So I carried out this intensive field work. But in the interim, before I did this formal follow-up period, I go back once to twice a year, and I continue to connect with the folks who participated in my initial project. But I decided to do this follow-up period of research as they moved into adulthood. And so we see the sample 54, mostly US-born youth, aged 14 to 19, when I started in 2004. And so also their parents, of course, they're minors, so their parents are very much involved in this research process too with me. But then I followed a cohort of 13 of them into their 20s, into the next decade, to understand how immigration enforcement continued to frame their realities and their lives as they became adults and perhaps started their own families. In terms of my research methods, they're somewhat conventional anthropological methods, and I'm certainly happy to talk more about that in the question and answer period if anybody would like to know more. I did participant observation, household and youth surveys, semi-structured interviews, focus groups. I also did photo voice, which way back then was exciting before everybody had their own smartphones and could document their daily lives on Instagram and such. But photo voice was part of it too, and they produced these powerful images of the ways in which enforcement had deep imprints on their lives. And so this is the research context and some comments on my method. But as I said in the beginning, I'd also like to set the stage in terms of what local configurations of enforcement look like, which of course in the border community starts at the border, right? So I'd first like to talk about enforcement at the border and what that looks like. And in particular, for my research participants, it means crossing this border crossing right here, the San Isidro Port of Entry, which is the largest international border crossing in the world. So it is sort of ground zero for understanding, in many respects, these dynamics of international border crossings. So what was it like for these young adults as they went about crossing the border? Many of them lived in these interesting transnational family configurations. And for families who have legal status and can cross, they go to Mexico quite a bit. So for those who have the status that enables them to, crossing the border is a very commonplace experience, right? So what happens to these young adults as they're crossing the border? Well, they're experiencing these aggressive and invasive questioning, right, on the part of Customs and Border Patrol agents. Bejarano calls this this exercise of ritualized violence, right? Who's crossed the border before at San Isidro Port of Entry? What's it like?
I haven't done San Isidro.
Which one have you done?
The one in Laredo.
Okay. And what's it like?
It feels like you're a criminal.
Yeah, it feels like you're a criminal. Even if you have your papers in order, your script down about what you've been doing in Mexico. So as a baseline, it's a stressful kind of encounter, right? But overlay that with youth and also family vulnerability, and it becomes yet another thing, right? So Esperanza tells us, one day when I forgot my ID, this is before real ID made it so that everybody had to have a passport and sort of hyper documentation. She said, the agent was being really rude to me. It's too bad I'm not an obvious citizen. Maybe if I was white and blonde-haired, they'd let me go by faster. But I'm dark. They can say, oh, she's Hispanic. You can classify me easily. That's what they do. So Esperanza is 17 years old as she's telling me this. She crosses frequently. Her brother at this point in time lived in Tijuana and commuted to the United States every day. But she understands very clearly that phenotype, that skin color, is precisely the mode by which she's being classified in these border crossing encounters, right? So it's very clear. She experiences this individually, right? So she's talking about her own experiences related to crossing. But it's also, especially if you think about, you can cross by yourself on foot or cross in a car with other folks, including family members, right? We can see that it's not just about individual experiences of being harassed by Customs and Border Protection, but it also indexes these larger family dynamics, and in this case, foregrounds deportation fear. And so here I'll return to Isabel. The one who would always go and get gum before she crossed the border, right? It had this ritual of comfort. Isabel said, even when we were minors, we knew that if they stopped us, even though we were with other family, if anything happened and they sent us to secondary inspection, what if they needed our parents to come and get us? It was always that fear. So for Isabel, it was not just about being harassed by Customs and Border Protection officers, but rather the cascade of events that might trigger, right? And always this concern about what might happen to her parents. And so at the border, then, we can see these ways in which there's these embodied forms of anxiety and distress that are being produced as people sort of engage in these interactions with officers, right? But then we also see it out in communities, right, in neighborhood enforcement. I include this picture here. This is actually from an outlet mall right on the other side of the San Isidro border crossing, where the Border Patrol is always present. So every time I've been here, there's Border Patrol agents circling around. And in fact, this used to be one of the high-volume crossing areas before the militarization of the border in the mid-1990s. So what happens in these neighborhood enforcement contexts? When I talked to these young adults about their childhoods, about what it was like to grow up in their neighborhood, it was clear that the Border Patrol was ever present and peppered in these childhood accounts. And so here, bear with me, this is a long one. I have some narrative here from Sal. So Sal says, we were playing freeze tag when I was 10. I ran outside the apartment complex and didn't notice the Border Patrol was there. They thought I was running because of them and were like, do you know it's against the law to run from the Border Patrol? I was like, I didn't even know you guys were out here. We were just playing a game. Eventually, they saw all of the kids coming out and what was going on, and were like, okay, we'll let you go. It was messed up. So Sal was 17 when he recounted this childhood event, right? So it was 7 years after this. But clearly, this is something that stuck with him, right? And shaped certainly the intervening 7 years in the way that he maneuvered through his neighborhood. And so I argue that the Border Patrol then inculcates this hyper-awareness, right, of state power, and also produces these deep-seated anxieties that children are literally carrying with them as they're moving through the neighborhood. And so the Border Patrol then, in some respects for children, becomes this boogeyman figure, right? It's this category of person, of thing that I don't quite understand, but I know that it's bad, and I know that it can hurt me and my family. Right? And so we see that when I'm looking at the enforcement effects in the narrative of Victoria, who I'll talk about next. So Victoria talks about how the Border Patrol, the presence of the Border Patrol, actually shapes the way that she maneuvers through her neighborhood. So she says, I don't know if the Border Patrol agents go undercover or dress like normal people, but my mom would always tell me they're in white vans. So when I see a white van, I get nervous and walk a different route. It's ingrained in me. So at this point, Victoria's 15. She's a U.S. citizen. She was born here. Her mother is a resident, and her father is a naturalized citizen. So all of them should have the protection of their status. But yet she's going around scoping out white vans and walking a different way because she's concerned about the encounter and what might transpire. So as I look then, so as I said, Victoria was 15 and Sal was 17 when I was talking to them about these episodes. But as I sort of mapped this over time and looked at the ways in which it carries forward into adulthood, my participants had these interesting ways of sort of reflecting back on what this meant in their childhood. And so with Tomas, it was really about revealing these shared family vulnerabilities, right? So his mom was undocumented. He said, we were always sheltered from the world because my parents were afraid to go places. But it's my fear too. I share in their fear. And actually, Tomas was not the only one that said something like this, right, about sharing in their fear. But it really indexes that this is not just an individualized anxiety about these potential Border Patrol encounters, but rather something that's experienced deeply as a family. Elisa allows us to see that this maps forward and continues forward into adulthood, right? So for her, it's this enduring fear. She says, I see the Border Patrol everywhere, even now, and I always feel a little scared. You learn that fear, and it sticks with you. In her case, she had a cousin who lived with them for many years, and so she went through the neighborhood sort of experiencing the fear of her cousin right alongside her, right? But here she is, I think at this point, a 26-year-old, talking about how when she sees the Border Patrol, it still stops her in her tracks because it's this deeply embodied fear that she's had for so long. So the enforcement effects then are profound and enduring, certainly as we look in the transition into adulthood. So as I was conducting my research, I had a particularly useful window into how it is that these families are contesting this enforcement regime, right? So what does it look like in this context to fight for inclusion? And so this came in the form of the immigrant rights protests of 2006. And so the very briefly, the immigrant rights protests of 2006, which were unprecedented, right? They cropped up in many cities throughout the country. There were millions of participants. They were youth-led in many respects, many places, including San Diego. HR 4437, which was passed in December 2005, sought to criminalize undocumented immigrants, so to make their status, to further criminalize their status, but also those who assisted them. So as Sal said, he recognized that it would affect him profoundly. He said, what am I supposed to do, not drive my mom to work? Right? So it has no accounting for certainly family units in this case. But what I was able to do through sort of talking to people about their participation in this movement was see that it was a pivotal moment in their development. Again, these are teenagers, right? So participating in these protests was really life-changing for them. But for a lot of them, what it did was sort of foster their legal consciousness, right? They had some awareness of their family's status vulnerabilities, but this really put it on the map in a different way and allowed them to engage with it in very particular ways. And so it started out for many of them being sort of this defensive posturing, right? I'm going to defend my family members. But really, it provided ultimately a platform for them critiquing these policies like HR 4437. Right? And so they articulated their messages, as Payaris has talked about, through this family frame, right? And so the family frame was really one of the most convincing frames of this, the whole, the civil rights and human rights sort of implications. Those were other frames that were used, and the deservingness frame that's come to be critiqued quite a bit, right? But the family frame, I think, was one of the enduring ones that we see carrying forward past 2006 too. Right. So Paulina, for instance, says, what motivated me to participate was my family. They're not criminals for being here and helping out the U.S. Of course, she did so without sneaking around, really, in some respects, and hiding the fact that she participated from her mother, because she didn't think her mother was going to be too excited about her skipping school to join the protest, right? But she did it for her family, as she said, right? And so my read on the immigrant rights protests of 2006 and the youth who participated in it was that you really saw youth blossoming into their advocacy role, right? By participating in these protests, including this one here is right at the U.S. Mexico border along the San Isidro port of entry, right on the other side of it. So they blossomed into this advocacy role. And it was just sort of coming to fruition in this period when they were teenagers, right after the immigrant rights protests. But as I've followed it over time, I've come to think about it as the brokering roles in which these young adults have continued to play, right? So their brokering actions extend into adulthood, right? And so what it is exactly is the leveraging of different aspects of who they are and their social position, right? Their secure immigration statuses. So a lot of folks talked about that in the protests, right? My parents can't be here, but I can. I'm a citizen. There's nothing at stake for me in that respect. But it's also bilingualism. It's knowledge of the system that perhaps their parents don't have, having grown up in it, as well as local knowledge bases. They know how to navigate around the Border Patrol. They know how to make their way through a border crossing, right, and what kinds of things you say. And so they have this particular set of knowledge, right, and skills that serve them quite effectively. And so I've seen this sort of operating on two different stages and interrelated in some respects too, and I'll provide an example of one individual for each of these. In the family realm, I'll return once again to Isabel. So once she graduated from high school, she became the highest wage earner in her family. Her parents were undocumented, very marginally employed. And as such, she came to have some sort of power and status within her household in particular ways, right? And so she was able to help stabilize family finances when her dad was having difficulty finding work, and in fact had to go to Arizona for a while because he wasn't able to find it in San Diego. So she has sort of growing power within her household, right, as a part of it. But the biggest way in which I saw this with her, have seen it with her, is in applying for and securing immigration status for her parents in her early 20s, which she was able to do. Others have not been able to do that. For their family members, right? As she says, it was such a relief, and of course that's an incredible understatement about how this changed her family life. But she's the one now sort of teaching her mom how to cross the border, what it's like to maneuver through these spaces that her mom has been avoiding for all this time, right? Isabel also happens to be a social worker. I've actually, somebody called me for a reference once and said, this work would be with vulnerable immigrant families. Do you think that she could handle working with this population? And I said, she's been doing this her whole life. She will flourish in this role. And in fact, she has. And Isabel just turned 30 last month. In this professional realm then, I'll highlight Esperanza. She majored in ethnic studies in college, despite being geared by her high school towards STEM fields. She gravitated towards ethnic studies because it helped her contextualize her childhood experiences, right, and her life up to that point. She continued on to law school and ultimately became an attorney, but she fashions herself, in her words, to be a quieter activist. Right? So she says, my approach is not being out there protesting, but working to make subtle changes that will have a long-term positive effect. And so I want us, as I draw this sort of case study to a close, to think about the ways in which protesting is certainly important, right, and actively contesting the immigration enforcement regime. But what are these other ways in which quieter acts of activism are also informing that project, right? And so as I shift, I'll give us a little bit of framing too in terms of the broader policy context, which is the shift to the U.S. interior, right, where we see in the midpoint of the first decade of the 2000s, the border as mobile technology, as Dowling and Inda have referred to it, where we see techniques perfected at the border exported to the interior, and specifically through these workplace and home raids. The purported target of these actions, carried out now by ICE, of course, right, which was, again, founded in 2003, or started in 2003, is immigrants with criminal backgrounds. And in fact, that's what we hear, right? We're only targeting the criminals, and of course we have databases that facilitate this process. But of course we know the reality is that many people are simply at the wrong place at the wrong time and are caught up in this dragnet nonetheless. But also we want to, kind of looking through this family frame and looking through the family as a unit here, recognize that the collateral damage in many respects is children, children who witness their parents being taken away in these violent home raids, right? As well as mixed status families who are destabilized economically and socially by having missing members suddenly in their midst. So we want to think through the broad effects of it. Looking to the very present, I want to highlight the fact that Trump is also, to draw from Washington Post reporters Sacheti and Miroff, building a wall no one can see. So with Trump, we give a lot of attention to the big, beautiful border fence, right? And he's finding sneaky ways of funding that. But he's also building this wall no one can see that's in all communities nationwide, right? Through these bureaucratic procedures and rules changes. Of course, the public charge rule having just gone into effect yesterday. So we see a lot of administrative changes, right? So yes, enforcement is still happening, but it's also happening in these sneakier kinds of ways too. So this is some of kind of setting the stage in some respects for the next project I'd like to highlight, which is my research here in Maryland. This project is ongoing. I started in 2016, which was before the presidential election, although certainly that loomed large for everybody that I was doing research with. I did a follow-up period of research from 2017 and 18 after the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, DACA program. It was announced that it was going to be rescinded. And so that tells you my focus here has really been on DACA recipients themselves, right? So my sample here is 30 DACA recipients. In 2016, they were within this age range. So within the psychology sort of age categories, still young adults. Right? They're residents of Montgomery and Prince George's counties. So Migration Policy Institute, this map shows the concentration of DACA recipients. The Burgundy, Montgomery County, is the highest concentration of DACA recipients, with the red Prince George's to follow. Of course, Baltimore County is there, and I have not done research there. That's its own unique local context. But my sample here is from 13 different countries of origin. So that's very different in many respects. They have a unifying aspect, right, of their identities and being DACA recipients. But yet there's a profound amount of difference in their experiences on the basis of other aspects of their intersectional identities, right? So that's been really interesting to see how these vulnerabilities play out in different communities. My methods are similar in some respects. I'll call attention to the formation of this community advisory board. We've met now 6 times, twice a year we meet. And in fact, we're experimenting with online space because they're all too busy adulting to be able to attend some of our meetings. So the Community Advisory Board has been a big part of this research, but also an important node of social support for my research participants, right, in this really challenging times. So in terms of the local configurations of enforcement here, we see increasing enforcement taking place through this late 2015 spate of new enforcement actions. So suddenly we're hearing about the series of local ICE raids, including in 7-Elevens, pictured here, about impromptu ICE checkpoints, including on University Boulevard on the way to our campus right here. Newspapers, local newspapers are covering these local effects in early 2016, right? So workplaces reporting high absenteeism, school buses being empty, local businesses declining in their business, as immigrant communities are dealing with the fear that these kinds of actions bring. Right? And so here I'll call upon Juan to talk about and reflect upon the building awareness of ICE that's taking place within local immigrant communities. So Juan says, ICE was almost like an urban legend here in Maryland. They existed, but I'd never seen them, so they didn't really exist in my mind. I knew the danger, it had just never become real for me. So suddenly it's becoming real, very real for Juan. And this is interesting too because Juan's family is actually from a border community. So he grew up in his early years in this heavily surveilled sort of space, right? And the family found some degree of refuge here in Maryland that no longer exists in the same way. In terms of the effects of enforcement, Madeline talks about the implications of being multiply targeted, right? So she said, Trump's insulted women, Africans, and Muslims. One of my colleagues at work was like, you're all three of those things. And I was like, yes, I am. There's so much Islamophobic and xenophobic rhetoric, but it's really just a different person saying it. And so certainly that maps onto Madeline's sort of commentary on her life and what life has looked like. She came when she was 2, so it's a new chapter in many respects, but the antecedents are there for her. What's interesting within this context, within this deteriorating sort of context, is the power of documents themselves, right? Which DACA recipients now possess, having not previously, right? So Juan says, I started carrying my work permit with me everywhere I go. Now I see clearly the danger of not having it. I make sure that if I go outside the house, I have it with me. It makes me feel a lot more secure. And so he's narrating in terms of his mental health, really, right? So he's talking about security, and that's really the idiom through which a lot of research participants started talking about their mental health, right? So it wasn't through these conventional anxiety and depression and these sorts of things, but rather this idiom of security that comes to be important. In terms of the effects, though, we do see increased psychological distress. So I included the validated PHQ-4 measure, and not surprisingly, we've seen an increase in psychological distress at these different time points, and clearly the rescission of the DACA program has an effect on that. But more importantly, I think the narratives speak more powerfully to this, right? So Pau talks about the amplified anxiety of this moment, saying, my mom got one of those video surveillance cameras to put outside of the house so she can make sure that it's not ICE agents when someone knocks. It sends a notification every time there's any motion. She checks it all the time, constantly. She's gotten much more anxious. So she's literally interacting with her phone constantly as she worries about who's knocking on the door. Right? In this case, we can see Pau may have anxiety as measured through the PHQ, but it's a family sort of anxiety too, right? As she talks about her mom. Juan also talks about his mother and her changing daily routines. Saying, my mom is a lot more cautious these days. She picks stores she feels comfortable in. She loves Costco because it's very heavily populated. She feels more comfortable with all those people around. She's leaning towards comfort more than convenience these days. So she's literally picking where she's shopping on the basis of her concern about ICE enforcement, right? And so this is interesting in many respects. I'm from Maryland, and when I came back in 2014, I expected to encounter a very different immigration context. But what's striking to me is the degree to which narratives like this sound like the border communities where I've spent most of my career doing research, right? So it is very local now in this respect. So what does fighting for inclusion look like here? How have DACA recipients and their family members and friends gone about actualizing that? In some respects, it is through their involvement in collective political action, and of course, dreamers are a force to be reckoned with and have really pushed political agendas and continue to do so. And so some of these youth, building on youth activism that they cultivated in support of the Maryland DREAM Act, which passed in 2012. So some of them sort of came of age in these community-based organizations working on sort of getting their activist chops in order to fight these sorts of causes. But I've found that actually most of my participants aren't participating in these formal collective action, event-based kinds of things, right? And so Lola talks about her own decline in participation, in part through a negative encounter that she had. So she says, I was asked to do an interview about DACA and was like, yeah, why not? I want more people to know about it. After, the reporter kept calling and texting and harassing me. She went through my LinkedIn and said I was lying about my name. She was like, send me a picture of your license. I was like, no, you're crazy. One of my friends was like, this is completely wrong, and texted her that I was retracting all of my statements. I'm more cautious on who I speak to now. And in fact, Lola talked about, as she referred to it, retreating to her safety bubble in the aftermath of this event, right, which was meant to be sort of this empowering activity that turned into this very problematic and troubling episode. So I've seen these interesting forms of everyday activism emerging in that context. So on the one hand, we could read sort of Lola's retreat from formal activism as being a negative thing and born of those types of experiences. But I'm also choosing to look at it as DACA recipients controlling the terms of the political engagement, right? Deciding who gets to hear their stories and how they get to hear their stories and in what format. And so we see a lot of intentionality in the way that they're participating in these everyday forms of activism. So for some, that means speaking out more in everyday life. So Artie here has never participated in any form of collective political action related to immigration. But yet he says, I try to share about my status as much as possible, like in class. A lot of people straight up call DACA recipients Mexican. Letting them know that there are other nationalities too diminishes the racism value of saying something like that. I see them thinking, wait a minute, he's a DACA recipient and he's Asian. So he's using these classroom spaces to sort of interrupt people's notions of what a DACA recipient is and looks like. And in fact, he takes great pleasure in doing so. He's kind of a character, and this has been, I think, a really sort of transformative exercise for him. Also, I see this happening more in the realm of this everyday brokering work that I see in San Diego as well, right, through these brokering activities. So Angelica says, I'm doing more of the hands-on work, directly providing services and bringing resources. I held 2 different clinics, one for unaccompanied minors and another that was safety planning for families in case of deportation. That's been my method of activism. And so we do see these different methods of activism emerging in this deeply contested political climate, right, in which we are currently. So in terms of some concluding thoughts here, I think I've demonstrated that immigration enforcement has far-reaching consequences, right? It reverberates throughout families and communities nationwide, and this is regardless of immigration status. But I also want to call attention to the fact that it targets those who may be ambiguously ethnic, or aren't, in the words of Esperanza, obvious citizens, right? So it's far-reaching, well beyond its nominal target. Right? And so we have to sort of recognize that if we are to reckon with it, and in particular in our local communities. So immigrants and their children bear the scars of these racializing policies and indeed of policy uncertainty. DACA recipients have been in this prolonged period of limbo as people decide, as politicians decide what's going to happen to them in the future. The ways in which they talk about this are through deep-seated anxiety, these shared fears, right, that stick with you over time. As well, we see it in the hyper-awareness that people have developed about border enforcement agents always being around, and also the shifting daily routines that change as a result of it, right? So we also see, I think, and certainly if I look at my sort of body of work over the last 20 years, evolving modes of contestation. So collective political action is essential, and certainly is something that needs to take place. But yet at the same time, we see this everyday activism, this really interesting work happening, as well as the brokering work of individuals who are well positioned to carry it out on the basis of their particular knowledge bases and skill sets, right? And so we have to acknowledge the place of that in the broader immigrant rights movement too, and think about how we can harness that collectively as we move forward. And I want to conclude by drawing us to the local, right? And thinking about local sites of inclusion and what they look like. They're quite necessary, frankly, in the absence of federal immigration reform, but also because of the nature of policymaking, right, which has shifted to states and localities. We can see that it becomes important to be involved in these smaller scale efforts, right, in what's going on, including in our campus community, right? So these local sites of inclusion can buffer, in many respects, the injurious impact of the immigration enforcement regime. And they allow us to do something, right? So we can ask the university why it is that we don't have a full-time, permanent, undocumented student coordinator, despite the demonstrated need for it. And we can look to Howard County, which has been really pushing for their county to extract themselves from these ICE agreements, right? So there's lots going on locally. And any Howard County people? You're Howard County people? Yeah, so you're a good example of sort of these local sites where we can see these contestations taking place. So I urge us to think about, this implicates all of us, right? These are our communities that we're a part of, to think about these local spaces for engaging in our own everyday activist sorts of activities too. So with that, I will open the floor for questions and comments.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, thank you. I would like to ask for questions, but to please ask that, just ask the question, okay? Because there are a lot of people who may want to ask questions, so if you would just stick with the question. Any questions, please? Yes.
So it was brilliant presentation.
Louder, please.
That was awesome, but what I do wonder is if you do show that presentation to, let's say, President Trump, he'd probably look at it and he'd say, like, this is the price we pay to keep our country immigrant free. How would you actually impact the policy on a federal level if you're going to have people like him who might see a presentation like this and would say, you know what, it's the price we pay?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of it, I think in some respects, it used to be, if we're looking at sort of categories of deservingness, that children and that citizens were sort of at the core of those who are deserving, right? So if the president is concerned with the populace at large, with the population and all of the segments, you can point to the consequences for U.S. citizen children, right, within this context, right? And so he should care. Of course, we see this not necessarily playing out in reality. But I think a large part of the effort, what I'm trying to engage in, is sort of deconstructing these law and order arguments, right? To think about the fact that we have a legal system in which you are innocent until proven guilty, right? So presumptive illegality, being stopped on the basis of Mexican appearance, right, defies the logic of our own legal system, right? So I think some of it's sort of pointing out the ways in which it targets populations that he and other politicians should care about. But I think also importantly, it's sort of speaking to these really hegemonic discourses, right, of legal neutrality that sort of dominate a lot of our conversation. But if I were to sit down with him, would I be able to convince him of these things? I'm not optimistic about that, right? But again, we can look at local sites, right? So perhaps that's not going to happen. But what does that mean locally, right? Who might be convincible here at the university or in Prince George's County or in these other places? So I don't know if that gets to your question there.
Thank you for a great presentation. I learned a lot. I have a question. When you were in the border doing your research, do you happen to, were there like a, because when you kind of compare like Maryland and the border, I don't know, do you happen to find a lot of undocumented people living right on the border, like in San Isidro, Nogales, or like places like that? Or they just happen to travel north or
No, they absolutely do live in communities like San Isidro, like National City, like the neighborhood in which I conducted my research. So they are right there, hidden in plain sight, right? But nonetheless being surveilled through these very particular processes.
okay, just thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, in the back.
So, thank you so much. I'm struck by the connections and the parallels to young people of color who have to endure the hypercriminalization by police. So I'm wondering if the young people that you studied see those connections with their fellow peers, right? Other people who are dealing with the state is a different force in some ways, right? It's the police. Do they get inspired to do cross-racial connections, right? Does that inspire political activism in that regard?
So looking at sort of the folks that I worked with in San Diego, many of whom I've known at this point for half or more of their lives, which is kind of crazy to think about. If I look at their experiences, they didn't necessarily make those connections when they were teenagers, when I first met them, right, in that context. And frankly, they didn't realize that it's not normal to have the Border Patrol outside all the time monitoring, right? They didn't sort of understand that in some respects. So as some of them moved away, went to college and that sort of thing, a lot of them did gravitate towards ethnic studies and these fields where they were able to sort of more explicitly make those connections. And so I'm thinking of Paulina, who's one of them who I talked about. She ended up working for a local chapter of a national organization, right, focused on these issues. And so it became, she was a youth activist, right, and so it became very empowering for her in many respects to draw out those parallels and to sort of educate youth like herself from her neighborhood about them. So over time, this is where I guess it's good to have this longitudinal view, right? To have this window into what it looks like when they're teenagers, but look at how that maps onto their realities as 20-somethings. And so I see that much more. Certainly in my other research with DACA recipients here, a lot of them are more attuned to sort of intersectional kinds of issues, right? And they're slightly older, I should note too, than the population that I worked with in San Diego when I met them in the first place. So yeah, I see that with them as being much more sort of part of who they are and their sort of worldviews, in part born by necessity, right, of being African, Muslim, and a woman, and that informing the way that you see the world.
In the way back.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. Give a brief context and then a question. I grew up in Silver Spring, and now I'm also in the academy.
Louder, please.
I grew up in Silver Spring. I'm also in the academy, so I went to Blair High School, came back to teach at Blair High School, so Lower Montgomery County, very diverse area. One of the questions that's come up in my thinking about things academically is sort of a moral hazard that can come up when, obviously, as any immigrant group, I'm African American, but just sort of immigrant group mentality. There's a way in which African Americans talk around the dinner table that's completely different than the way we might talk to white people. And the same is true for those from Central America or whatever. There's a way in which we speak when we know it's being academic. There's a way in which we speak, when it's just us. And a lot of that conversation is, you say things you normally wouldn't say, their views. People don't assume African Americans think about African Americans, or Central Americans don't think about Central Americans. And so one of the issues is, as academics, and as just curious people, we can sort of say, hey, I want you to tell your story, it's going to be good, it's going to help policy. But there can my question is, how as a scholar do you navigate some of that moral hazard? Because one of the things one sees in the African American community is a rise in anxiety, depression, suicide. African Americans have can make an argument, have gone through worse stuff. But part of the thing is that sort of the bonds, and the valent bonds of family and community, as these have broken. For me to come to a young man and say, hey, you gotta tell your story. And then he goes and tells his story, and he's sort of out there. You know, and maybe the best thing for him to do is to, you know, not tell his story, to go to the park and smoke a cigarette. I don't know, but what I'm saying is, these things have, you know, huge consequences. And so, and I'm speaking to myself. I'm not. This isn't a finger pointing, but I grapple with this stuff. So there needs. I just want to hear sort of your ideas of the moral ecology that needs to be knitted together, coming from outside in, or even, you know, for me, inside to inside. What are the? There has to be some kind of calculus. Otherwise, you know, I'll feel like I'm pimping people to write articles. It's effed up. So, just to kind of hear some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of this in two different ways. One is in terms of my own sort of engagement as a scholar in the field work that I do, right? And being a white woman who studies immigration enforcement, who may not be there for all of these conversations, right? In part because of who it is that I am. So in terms of anthropological field work, I think a lot of what we try to do is to get to know people and to build trust with people that, you know, along sort of lines of difference, right? So for me, it's, you know, as I said, I've known these young adults, the San Diego folks, for half of their lives, and I serve as job references and that sort of thing. So I exist in relationship to them in particular ways, right? Which is not to say I know, I will never know. I've crossed the U.S. Mexico border countless times, and as a white person who is a citizen who speaks unaccented English, you know, I don't know what it's like to be them, right? I can get at it through the stories that they tell me, and I can do my best to understand what that process is like, but I don't have that deep level embodied sort of reflection on it as a result of my own experience. So it's a question of fieldwork in some respects, but as you're talking about activism and thinking about, you know, some people were concerned with the immigrant rights protests in 2006 that young people were going to sort of be overactivated in a sense and think that they could protest anything and everything and change things, right? Because ultimately this law did not go into effect. So there was a lot of concern about sort of the political socialization of kids in that context and sort of the limits of their activism. But mostly in thinking about your question or your comments here, you know, I'm thinking about sort of the telling of stories. I'm an anthropologist. We are storytellers, right? That is what we do. But also the ways in which I think a lot of DACA recipients in this current moment have had to become defensive and protective of the stories that they're telling, right? And think about that as sort of privileged stories that are shared in particular ways in particular moments, right? That aren't for public consumption. And there's been in the Dreamer and DACA social movement a lot of pushback against the ways that stories have been co-opted, right, into this like perfect dreamer narrative on the one hand, but also kind of the downside and the negative side of sharing stories. So I hear you very much, and I take very seriously your comments, and I don't have the sort of perfect answer to them, but I think it's important to think about sort of these moral kinds of issues, particularly in thinking through youth and young people, right, and their political engagement processes.
Great talk, thank you. So I'm curious about the discourses of resistance that you've encountered. So to what extent are you finding that when people talk about the ways that they might resist or become an activist, do they tend to talk about the law, working through legal processes in order to resist? Or maybe the formal political systems, they talk about, well, we need a new candidate that's going to be sympathetic. And to what extent are the people you're interviewing and talking to giving you a sense that there's, you know, none of it's really working to me? It's sort of like trying to appeal to the the oppressor's rule book in order to, it's just not going to work ultimately, and they're kind of trying to find other ways of resisting and disengaging and withdrawing. I'm wondering if you saw that, is that framing even useful?
Well, it's interesting because, there's a whole political science and actually sociological literature looking at message framing, right, and what works. If it's not the human rights frame, the family frame, the deservingness frame, all these different ways of engaging. To some degree, that doesn't necessarily map onto sort of the strategic planning of the folks that I participate, who I conduct research with. But what it is that works, what moves the needle. I think in some respects, DACA recipients have been very astute in figuring this out in some respects, right? And they've pushed back against this deservingness narrative, right? Holding up this prototypical, high-achieving, perfect dreamer, right? And sort of recrafting and reframing that narrative. But what I hear from them a lot is also just the everyday interactions, right? The power of, and I think this is testament to dreamers who have really put that social movement on the map, right? But the meaningful interactions they have with coworkers who didn't realize that they even knew a DACA recipient, and sort of engaging with people in that way as a way of kind of moving the needle there. So it's been less about in this realm of sort of formal collective action and more in these everyday interactions with people, I've found anyway.
Last question. Yes. This is probably a really obvious question, but I hope you'll share your thoughts on what you expect in the coming census. How do you think that will play out?
Yeah. So, the census is obviously was made into a political issue here, right? About this addition of the citizenship question and that sort of thing. But I know, the folks here on campus or the Office of Community Engagement are very much involved in sort of getting out the word and getting people to participate in the census, right? There's a value in being counted, resource allocation, and these sorts of things. But given everything that I've just laid out here, there's a lot of fear about being counted in this context and what's going to be done with the data, especially as we see, again, sort of, Trump proposing to use data itself in these new and scary Brave New World kinds of ways. So I think absolutely, the tension between both of those, being counted and concerns about being counted, frames the current exercise we're going through in terms of the census.
Any hope?
Any hope? I don't know. I remain hopeful, actually, about all of this. But I think, again, the everyday and the local are important sites, right, where we can work against this, right? So I guess I'll conclude on that note.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you on behalf of the Baha'i for this talk. Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you. That was really, it was an exquisite lecture which took us through a journey of what the issues are and brought us up to date. We could all not be here today if it wasn't for some people that I need to thank. One is our assistant director, Dr. Kate Seaman. Yes. And our student intern, Sarah Rissanen, in the back. And from Vsauce ambassador, is Ariana here? She's not here. There you are. Thank you very much for being here. I just want to announce, if I may, our next event. 2 events left this semester. The next one is April 6th by Dr. Joseph Richardson, Jr. from our African American Studies program, Life After the Gunshot, a digital storytelling project on the impact of structural and interpersonal violence and the healing process for young Black men. If you go to our website, you will see the time and the room. It'll be in this building. And on April 14th, we have a one-day conference on global climate crisis, seeking solutions. It is a virtual conference. Therefore, the speakers won't be here. They'll be coming in virtually from all around the world. And we have a link so that it'll be live streamed and you can watch it wherever you are. And just follow us on our social media, go to our website, and we will have information about these events. So we really encourage you to please come out and support us, or virtually watch our conference on climate crisis. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you. Thank you so much.